There is a particular kind of confidence that only comes from having nothing left to lose. In the summer of 1903, a 21-year-old man named Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi stepped off a steamship and onto the docks of Boston Harbor with $2 in his pocket and a plan he described, without any apparent self-consciousness, as to get rich. He had come from Lugo, a modest town in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy, carrying the kind of unreasonable optimism that the early 20th century seemed to produce in abundance. The belief that America was not just a place but a promise, and that the promise was personal. He was not, by any objective measure, extraordinary. He was of average height, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a smile that acquaintances would later describe, repeatedly, as irresistible. He spoke almost no English. He had a secondary school education. He had no trade, no connections, no capital. What he did have, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Charles Ponzi before we understand anything else, was an almost pathological belief in the power of perception. In his own memoirs, written decades later from a very different position, he would reflect that a smooth tongue and a ready smile are worth more in this world than all the education money can buy. That was not cynicism. That was his operating philosophy, and he had arrived in America ready to test it. The years between 1903 and 1919 were, to put it charitably, an education in failure. Ponzi worked as a waiter in New York and was fired for shortchanging customers. He moved to Montreal and worked as a bank clerk for the Banco Zerossi, a financial institution that, it turned out, was itself engaged in fraud, paying depositors with new deposits rather than investment returns. It was, in a structural sense, a preview of his own future. He watched his employer flee to Mexico ahead of the investigators. He did not flee. Instead, he forged a check. He was arrested, convicted, and spent 3 years in the St. Vincent de Paul Penitentiary in Quebec. Upon his release, he attempted to help smuggle Italian immigrants illegally across the American border from Canada. He was arrested again. He served a further 2 years in an Atlanta federal prison. He was released in 1911 and spent the next several years drifting through the American South and Northeast, taking odd jobs, living in boarding houses, always at the edge of destitution, always convinced that the next opportunity was just around the corner. It would be easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to read these years as the inevitable prologue to a villain. But that framing distorts the historical reality. Ponzi was one of millions of immigrants navigating an economy that was, in many respects, designed to keep people like him on the margins. He did not have access to credit. He did not have the education or the connections that opened doors to legitimate capital formation. The financial system of early 20th century America was not a meritocracy. It was a hierarchy based on ethnicity, family ties, and established wealth. When Ponzi later claimed, in interviews from the peak of his fame, that he had simply found a way to play the game the way the game had always been played, he was not entirely wrong about the game, even if he was being deliberately dishonest about his particular way of playing it. By 1919, Ponzi was living in Boston, working as a clerk for a small trading company, and married to Rose Necco, the daughter of a local Italian grocer. He was 37 years old. He had been in America for 16 years. He had nothing. And then, in the autumn of that year, he received a letter from a business contact in Spain, and inside the letter was a small, perforated coupon. It was an international reply coupon, and it would change everything. To understand why the scheme worked, not just psychologically, but technically, you have to understand the world it was born into. The International Reply Coupon was a creation of the Universal Postal Union, established in 1906. The concept was straightforward. A person in one country could purchase a coupon, include it in a letter sent abroad, and the recipient in the foreign country could exchange that coupon at their local post office for enough postage to send a letter back. It was a mechanism designed to facilitate international correspondence, particularly for immigrants who wanted to help their families in other countries communicate more easily. It was mundane. It was bureaucratic. It was not, in any obvious way, an investment vehicle. But Ponzi saw something that most people didn't. The coupons were priced at fixed exchange rates set by the Universal Postal Union, rates that had been established before the First World War and had not been updated to reflect the catastrophic devaluations that the war had caused across European currencies. In practical terms, This meant that a coupon purchased in war-devastated Italy for the equivalent of 1 American cent could theoretically be exchanged in the United States for a stamp worth 6 cents. A 500% return embedded in a postal coupon. The idea was not fraudulent. It was a genuine arbitrage opportunity, the same basic mechanism that traders use in foreign exchange markets every day. Ponzi did not invent the concept. Academic economists had actually written about this specific opportunity in postal coupons. The idea was real. The math, in small quantities, was real. The problem, and Ponzi either understood this immediately and ignored it, or convinced himself it didn't matter, was one of scale and logistics. The coupons could not actually be converted into cash. They could only be exchanged for stamps. And stamps, in the quantities required to generate meaningful profit, could not be sold quickly or cheaply. There was no liquid market for bulk postage. More fundamentally, to execute the arbitrage at the scale required to pay 50% returns to hundreds of investors, Ponzi would have needed to purchase, ship, and exchange hundreds of millions of physical coupons. The postal systems of the relevant countries, Italy, Spain, France, simply could not have processed that volume. The mechanism that was theoretically sound was practically impossible. Ponzi knew this, or should have. But by the time the math stopped working on paper, he had already started talking to investors. In December 1919, he founded the Securities Exchange Company, a name chosen with deliberate ambiguity, designed to evoke legitimacy without making any specific regulatory claims. He began offering investors promissory notes. Invest $100, he said. In 45 days, you receive $150 back. That is a 50% return in 6 weeks. Annualized, that is approximately 400%. The first investors were mostly members of Boston's Italian immigrant community, people who knew Ponzi, who trusted him in the way that people trust members of their own community when formal institutions have historically failed them. He paid them back, on time, with interest. Word spread. More investors came. Ponzi paid them back too. The early returns were real, funded by new investors' principal, not by any actual trading profits, but real in the sense that the checks cleared. And nothing, in the short-term psychology of investment, is more convincing than a check that clears. Within 3 months, he had hired agents working on commission. He had set up offices across New England. He had moved his operation from a borrowed desk to a suite of offices on School Street in downtown Boston. By May 1920, he was taking in more than $400,000 a week. By July, he was taking in more than $1 million a week. The Securities Exchange Company had become, in less than 8 months, one of the most extraordinary money-gathering operations in American history. And not $1 of it had ever been invested in postal coupons. Investigators would later calculate that, at the peak of his scheme, Ponzi would have needed to have approximately 160 million international reply coupons in circulation to justify his claimed investments. The actual number in circulation worldwide, at that time, was approximately 27,000. There is a question that historians, economists, and psychologists have been asking for over a century, and it is not the question most people think it is. The question is not, how could Ponzi have deceived so many people? The question is, what were the specific psychological conditions that made this particular deception so universally effective? The answer illuminates something deeply uncomfortable about how human cognition works, and why, despite our certainty that we would never be fooled by something so obvious in retrospect, almost all of us are vulnerable to its modern equivalents. The first mechanism at work was social proof. This is the cognitive shortcut by which we use the behavior of others as evidence of the correct course of action. In environments of uncertainty, and financial decision-making is almost always an environment of uncertainty, we look to see what people like us are doing. In Boston in 1920, people like Ponzi's investors were investing with Ponzi. Their neighbors were investing. Their relatives were investing. The local barber, the local tailor, the local priest had invested. When everyone around you appears to be making money, the psychological cost of not participating begins to feel more threatening than the financial risk of participating. This is not naivety. It is a rational response to information scarcity. The information just happened to be wrong. The second mechanism was authority bias. Ponzi understood, with an almost intuitive precision, that people do not invest in opportunities. They invest in people who appear to know what they are doing. He dressed impeccably. He drove a luxury car. He moved into a lavish home in the wealthy suburb of Lexington, Massachusetts. He gave interviews. He was photographed. He was quoted in newspapers that described him as a financial genius, a man who had cracked a code that had escaped Wall Street. When the Boston Post ran a profile of him in February 1920 that was, in tone, closer to a celebrity profile than an investigative piece, it did more to fuel investment than any advertisement he could have bought. The appearance of success is, for many investors, indistinguishable from the substance of it, until, suddenly, it isn't. The third mechanism was confirmation bias. Once a person had invested with Ponzi and received their first payment on time, they had acquired a powerful piece of personal evidence that he was legitimate. Every subsequent payment reinforced that belief. When early skeptics raised doubts, and there were skeptics, even in 1920, the investors who had already been paid had a ready answer. I already made money from this man. I have proof. Your doubts are not evidence. My returns are. The human mind is extraordinarily efficient at protecting its existing beliefs from contradictory information, particularly when those beliefs are attached to financial decisions that feel irreversible. The fourth mechanism was, paradoxically, loss aversion. Behavioral economists have demonstrated repeatedly that people feel the psychological pain of a loss approximately twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. In 1920, for the immigrant communities of Boston and New England, the psychological math was not simply, I might gain 50%. It was, I have spent years being poor in this country, and this is my chance to stop being poor, and if I don't take it, I will have failed.
The fear of not participating, the fear of watching their neighbors become prosperous while they remain behind, was for many investors more powerful than any rational assessment of risk. There is something important to say here about the specific population of Ponzi's investors, because the mainstream historical narrative has not always been generous to them. They were disproportionately immigrants, disproportionately working class, disproportionately people who had been systematically excluded from the mainstream financial architecture of early 20th century America. They could not easily access bank loans. They did not have stockbrokers. The formal mechanisms of wealth accumulation that were available to established Anglo-Protestant families in Boston were not available. To Italian and Jewish and Portuguese immigrants in the same city, Ponzi offered them something that the legitimate economy had refused: access, participation, the possibility of upward mobility. This is not a defense of the decision to invest. It is a reminder that the decision existed within a context, and that the context was one of systematic economic exclusion that made the promise of a shortcut particularly seductive to people who had spent years being told that the long road was closed to them. At its peak, the Securities Exchange Company had over 17,000 investors, representing deposits of roughly $15 million, the equivalent of approximately $280 million today. The investors included factory workers and businessmen, housewives and civil servants, police officers and politicians. A police lieutenant deposited his entire savings. Members of the Boston city government had accounts. The scheme had metastasized far beyond any single community and into the mainstream of Boston financial life. And through all of it, Charles Ponzi smiled. He gave interviews, he bought his wife a rose garden, he hired a butler. He tipped extravagantly. He was, to all appearances, the most contented man in Massachusetts. The story of Charles Ponzi is usually told as a story about one man. It should also be told as a story about institutions. There were, by the spring of 1920, multiple parties who had both the information and the authority to intervene in the Securities Exchange Company's operations, and did not. Understanding why they failed is not an exercise in blame. It is an exercise in recognizing the structural dynamics that allow fraud to operate in the open, sometimes for years, before anyone with the power to stop it actually does. The press was the first institution to encounter Ponzi at scale, and its initial response was not skepticism, but celebration. The Boston Post, which would eventually win a Pulitzer Prize for its role in exposing the fraud, first ran a profile of Ponzi in late July 1920 that was breathless with admiration. His company was described as a remarkable success. His returns were reported at face value. He was positioned as a symbol of American possibility. The immigrant made good. This was not journalistic negligence in the crude sense. It reflected the editorial assumptions of the era that financial success was self-validating. that a man who appeared wealthy was probably wealthy for legitimate reasons, and that skepticism of success was somehow unpatriotic. Ponzi understood these assumptions and played to them relentlessly. He courted reporters. He was quotable, charismatic, and endlessly entertaining. He was good copy. The Massachusetts banking commissioner, Pierre J., was aware of Ponzi's operations by April 1920 at the latest. An initial investigation found that the Securities Exchange Company could not fully account for the disposition of investor funds. A formal audit was recommended. It was delayed. The political and social pressure from investors who were, at that point, receiving their returns on time was significant. Regulators who moved against Ponzi faced the prospect of being accused of destroying a successful immigrant business and depriving ordinary people of their investment returns. In the short term, doing nothing was the path of least political resistance. In the longer term, the delay allowed the scheme to gather a further several $1 million from new investors. The banking system itself played an ambiguous role. The Hanover Trust Company, a Boston bank, processed enormous volumes of Ponzi's transactions and had a relationship with him that went well beyond simple Its president, Daniels, had personal financial relationships with Ponzi and had, in fact, been the recipient of loans from Ponzi that gave him a personal financial interest in the continuation of the scheme. This was not a unique circumstance. Across the financial system, there were individuals who had direct or indirect financial stakes in Ponzi's continued operation, and those stakes created incentives to look away rather than to ask hard questions. The Postal Service itself, the institution whose coupons provided the theoretical basis for the entire enterprise, conducted its own quiet investigation and concluded, by early 1920, that Ponzi's scheme was not actually purchasing postal reply coupons at any meaningful scale. This finding was not immediately shared with banking regulators or law enforcement. The bureaucratic silos that separated different government agencies allowed information that might have ended the fraud months earlier to sit unshared in the files of postal inspectors, while the scheme continued to gather momentum. It was, ultimately, the press that broke it open. But not through the kind of investigative journalism that is often retrospectively credited. In late July 1920, the Boston Post hired a financial analyst named Clarence Barron, founder of what would eventually become Barron's Financial Magazine, to examine Ponzi's claims. Barron's analysis was straightforward and devastating. He calculated that to generate the returns being promised, Ponzi would need to be operating with 160 million postal reply coupons. The number in circulation worldwide was, as noted, a tiny fraction of that. The scheme was mathematically impossible. Barron made this public. Simultaneously, it emerged that Ponzi had a criminal record. The forgery conviction in Montreal, the smuggling arrest, the prison time. He had hidden this history carefully, and the revelation shook investor confidence even among those who did not fully understand Barron's financial analysis. On July 26, 1920, state auditors entered the offices of the Securities Exchange Company, Ponzi, in a move that seemed designed either to demonstrate supreme confidence or to buy time. Immediately suspended new deposits and announced that he was cooperating fully with investigators. He told reporters he was unconcerned. He continued to smile. By August 9, 1920, it was over. Ponzi was arrested. His company was insolvent. The $15 million in deposits had been consumed by operating expenses, by the lavish lifestyle, by the payments to early investors, and this was the structural core of every Ponzi scheme. Then and now, by the fundamental mathematics of compound fraud to sustain exponentially growing return obligations. You need exponentially growing new investment, and eventually the growth rate required exceeds any possible rate of new recruitment. The collapse of the Securities Exchange Company was not a single event. It was a cascade. When the auditors arrived on July 26th, the Hanover Trust Company, whose president had been financially entangled with Ponzi, failed within days, unable to withstand the withdrawal demands of panicked depositors. 3 other small Boston banks also collapsed in the weeks that followed, the victims of their own exposure to Ponzi-related deposits and the crisis of confidence his collapse triggered. Thousands of investors who had accounts in these institutions lost money twice, once through Ponzi and again through the institutional failures his exposure caused. The legal proceedings against Ponzi were protracted and, in certain respects, legally complicated. He was charged with federal mail fraud, to which he eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. But the federal prosecution was only the beginning. Massachusetts brought its own criminal charges. He appealed. The appeals generated new hearings. The hearings generated new decisions. He was in and out of custody and in and out of the courts for the better part of a decade. While the legal machinery ground forward, the victims waited. Bankruptcy trustees worked to recover and distribute assets, an extraordinarily difficult task given that Ponzi had mingled, spent, and scattered funds across multiple banks, businesses, and personal accounts. In the end, investors recovered approximately 30 cents on every dollar they had deposited, meaning that more than $10 million simply ceased to exist. For working-class families who had invested their life savings, recovering 30 cents on the dollar was not a partial victory. It was financial ruin. Ponzi served his federal sentence, was released, and was immediately arrested by Massachusetts authorities on state charges. He was convicted again. He appealed again. In 1926, while out on bail during his appeal, he fled to Florida, where he had, with characteristic optimism and complete indifference to recent events, become involved in a land speculation scheme. He sold swamp-adjacent lots to buyers who were not always clearly informed about the nature of what they were purchasing. He was arrested in Florida, extradited, and eventually served his Massachusetts sentence. He was deported to Italy in 1934, having been stripped of his American citizenship. He died in Rio de Janeiro in 1949, having spent his last years working as a translator and airline official for a Brazilian carrier. He died in a charity hospital with a net worth of approximately $75. He never stopped believing, in some fundamental way, that he had been right, that the opportunity had been real, that the timing had simply been against him, that if the scheme had only had more time, he could have found a way to make it work. He said as much in his memoirs, which he wrote with evident care, and which were, in their own way, the final performance of a man who had built his entire life on the premise that the story you tell about yourself matters more than the facts. The name Ponzi became, in the century after his arrest, the generic term for a specific category of financial fraud, a scheme in which returns are paid to early investors using the capital of new investors, creating the appearance of legitimate profits while the underlying pool of funds steadily depletes. This naming is a kind of cultural immortality, and it is worth pausing to understand what exactly is being memorialized. It is not the mechanics. The mechanics of the fraud were not invented by Ponzi. They had been used before him and would have been used after him regardless of what he did in Boston in 1920. What Ponzi contributed was the scale, the audacity, and the particular moment, the confluence of a booming economy, an underserved immigrant investor class, an immature regulatory infrastructure, and a press culture that was structurally incapable of skepticism about visible financial success. What the century since 1920 has demonstrated, with a persistence that should disturb us, is that none of those conditions were unique to 1920. Bernie Madoff ran his own scheme for at least 17 years, possibly longer, while managing money for the most sophisticated institutional investors in the world: feeder funds, European banks, charitable foundations, hedge fund managers, who themselves prided themselves on analytical rigor. He was arrested in December 2008 for a fraud estimated at $65 billion.
He had been investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission multiple times. He had been flagged by at least one analyst, Harry Markopoulos, who submitted detailed written analyses to the SEC demonstrating that Madoff's claimed returns were mathematically impossible, an argument remarkably similar to Barron's 1920 analysis of Ponzi. The SEC did not act. Madoff, like Ponzi, operated in the open, in plain sight, for years, while the institutional infrastructure designed to protect investors looked away. The question this raises is not, why do individual fraudsters keep appearing? The question is, why do the institutional conditions that allow fraud to scale keep reasserting themselves? Part of the answer lies in what behavioral economists call the inspection paradox of financial regulation. Regulatory agencies are funded by governments, which are elected by voters, who are frequently also investors. When markets are rising and investors are happy, there is minimal political will to fund aggressive financial oversight. Regulators who investigate successful appearing firms run the risk of disrupting profitable businesses, generating negative headlines, and alienating voter investors who don't want their returns questioned. The political incentives, in boom times, run systematically against the kind of proactive investigation that would catch Ponzi-type schemes before they collapse under their own weight. A second part of the answer lies in the psychology of expertise. There is a well-documented phenomenon, sometimes called the illusion of explanatory depth, in which people believe they understand complex systems far better than they actually do. Applied to finance, this means that investors, even sophisticated ones, often mistake familiarity with understanding. They know the names of the instruments, the shape of the return curve, the vocabulary of the pitch. But knowing the vocabulary of a thing is not the same as understanding the underlying mechanics, and it is in the gap between vocabulary and understanding that fraud finds its operating space. Ponzi's investors didn't fully understand postal reply coupons. Madoff's institutional investors didn't fully understand split-strike conversion strategies. The sophistication of the packaging scaled up. The fundamental dynamic of trusting authority over verifying mechanisms did not change. A third part of the answer is more uncomfortable still. Financial fraud, at scale, generally requires a phase during which it is genuinely producing returns for investors. Early participants in a Ponzi scheme actually make money. Those early returns are not fictional. They are real cash, paid on time, generating real satisfaction. This means that the population of people who have direct experiential evidence that the scheme works is always, in the early phases, larger than the population who have direct experiential evidence that it doesn't. By the time the scheme collapses, the evidence of failure is catastrophic, but the evidence of success that accumulated during the growth phase is psychologically indelible for those who experienced it. This creates communities of true believers who resist the retrospective verdict, who insist that it could have worked, that the investigation was politically motivated, that the returns they personally received were proof of something real. These communities are not irrational. They are responding rationally to the evidence they personally experienced. They are also, in a very human sense, protecting themselves from a conclusion that is psychologically unbearable, that they were deceived, that their judgment failed them, that the confidence they felt was manufactured by someone who understood their vulnerabilities better than they understood their own. Charles Ponzi arrived in America in 1903 with $2 and an unshakable belief in the power of a good story. He left it, in chains, in disgrace, stripped of his citizenship, with nothing but the story itself. And the story outlasted him by a century, and counting. There is something almost tragic in the full accounting of his life. Not in the sense that he deserves sympathy he was never willing to extend to his victims, but tragic in the ancient sense. A man whose genuine talents were exactly calibrated to destroy him. His charisma, his belief in his own narrative, his inability to distinguish between the performance of success and its substance, his conviction that the rules that applied to ordinary people could be suspended, temporarily, in his case, until the plan caught up with the promise. These are not exotic psychological traits. They are recognizable. They are, in various proportions, present in every human being who has ever convinced themselves that one small shortcut wouldn't hurt anyone. What made Ponzi exceptional was not the quality of his character, but the scale of his application. He applied these ordinary human tendencies, in himself and in his investors, at a scale and with a precision that turned them into an engine of mass harm. And in doing so, he produced something that no legitimate investment ever managed, a piece of cultural vocabulary so durable that it is still in use, without need of translation, in every country on Earth, more than 100 years later. His name is a warning embedded in the language. The question is whether we have actually been listening. The postal reply coupons, the school street offices, the rose garden in Lexington, the smiling photographs, all of it is gone. But the psychology that built it, and the psychology that funded it, and the psychology that failed to stop it until millions of dollars of working-class savings had been consumed, that psychology did not go away when Charles Ponzi was deported from Boston Harbor in November 1934. It moved into a penthouse in Manhattan. It set up a hedge fund. It gave money to charity. It was photographed at galas with senators and celebrities. It was investigated twice and cleared. It sent its clients their statements every month, showing consistent, moderate, believable returns. Nothing as gaudy as 50% in 45 days. Nothing that would trip an alarm. Just the steady, reassuring hum of a machine that appeared to work. And then, in December 2008, that machine stopped. and $65 billion was gone. Charles Ponzi did not invent this. He only gave it a name. The original sin, if we are being precise, is much older than he was, and much more widely distributed. It is the ancient human preference for a persuasive story over a verifiable fact. It is the trust we extend to people who look like they know what they are doing. It is the fear of being left behind while others prosper. It is the unwillingness of institutions to act when acting is politically costly. These are not weaknesses that belong to a particular era or a particular class of people. They are features of human cognition and institutional design that reassert themselves in every generation, dressed in the vocabulary of whatever financial instruments happen to be fashionable at the time. Consider what the 21st century has produced. Cryptocurrency offered, at various points, the same intoxicating combination of technological novelty, community belonging, spectacular early returns, and the promise of democratized access to wealth. The vocabulary was different: blockchain, DeFi, staking yields, token economics, but the psychological substrate was identical. Early participants made extraordinary returns. Their enthusiasm recruited new participants. The returns paid to early participants came from new participants' capital. When the underlying value failed to materialize at the scale the returns implied, the structure collapsed. The specific technical architecture was novel. The human story was a century old. NFTs, multi-level marketing structures, certain real estate investment vehicles, leveraged yield products. Across all of them, the same pattern reasserts itself with a regularity that should be instructive. Novel technical packaging, community endorsement, early returns that are real and therefore convincing. Expansion driven more by new recruitment than by underlying value creation. Regulatory inattention during the growth phase. Catastrophic collapse when the recruitment curve flattens. Victims who are told, explicitly or implicitly, that they should have known better. The should have known better conclusion is perhaps the most insidious piece of the legacy. It serves, in every generation, to shift moral responsibility from the architects of the fraud and the institutional failures that enabled it onto the individuals who were deceived. It transforms a systemic failure into a personal one. It allows regulators and politicians and financial journalists to avoid accountability by pointing to the victims and saying, "You were greedy. You were naive. You chose poorly." This framing is not only cruel, it is analytically useless because it tells us nothing about how to prevent the next iteration and the one after that. What would actually help, what the full account of Charles Ponzi's life and fraud and legacy actually points toward, is a different kind of financial literacy. Not literacy in the mechanics of specific instruments, which change every decade, but literacy in the psychology of deception itself. The ability to recognize social proof being manufactured rather than arising organically. The habit of asking who benefits from my belief and how. The willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than resolving it prematurely in favor of a compelling story. The understanding that legitimate investments do not generally require urgency, community pressure, or the implicit message that you will be left behind if you hesitate. These skills are not instinctive. They run counter to social instincts that evolution built into human cognition for good reasons. Being responsive to social proof is usually adaptive. Extending trust to authority figures is usually rational. Acting on loss aversion is usually self-protective. The fraudster's art consists in finding situations where these adaptive tendencies become vulnerabilities, and in constructing environments that reliably trigger them. Ponzi was exceptionally good at this construction. He was not, in the end, a master of finance. He was a master of human psychology, specifically of the psychology of hope. And hope, in the right circumstances, in the hands of the right person, with the right timing, can be worth millions. It was worth, in the summer of 1920, approximately $15 million. It cost the people who trusted it nearly everything they had. Understanding Charles Ponzi, really understanding him, not as a cartoon villain, but as a human being operating in a specific set of conditions, exploiting specific psychological mechanisms, enabled by specific institutional failures, is not an academic exercise. It is an act of self-defense. Because the man is gone, but the scheme is always hiring.